In a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other, there was a family tragedy that no one could foresee. A young woman named Amina, only 19 years old, had lost everything she once knew. Her parents, her home, her sense of belonging, all vanished in an instant. After the death of her beloved mother and father, she had nowhere left to turn. There was only one relative left in her life, her grandfather, Abdul Rahman, a man deeply respected by the community, known for his piety and his words of wisdom. He was her last thread of family, her one remaining protector, or so it seemed. But behind his kind smile and familiar face, there were secrets. Dark secrets that would slowly creep into Amina's life, breaking down everything she believed was safe and trustworthy. She was innocent, trusting her grandfather as the only family she had left. She felt safe in his home, wrapped in the warmth of his promises to protect her. But she could never have imagined the nightmare that awaited her. As the weeks passed, she began to feel a shift, a subtle change in his behavior. Small things at first. His lingering gazes, his restrictive rules, his sudden anger at the smallest mistakes. Amina dismissed these thoughts, telling herself he was just being protective. But deep down, a strange unease started growing, a feeling she couldn't quite explain, a fear that she tried so hard to push away. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting shadows around her grandfather's home, he handed her a warm cup of tea. The kind gesture made her smile, easing the tension she'd felt that day. She took a sip, feeling the warmth slide down her throat, grateful for the comfort. But little did she know, that sip would change her life forever. Hours later, Amina awoke with blurred memories, strange flashes of a nightmare she couldn't piece together. A heaviness hung over her mind, a weight that felt inescapable. As the days turned into weeks, her body began to betray the secret her grandfather had hidden within her. Amina didn't understand what was happening to her. She felt herself changing in ways that terrified her, experiencing symptoms she'd never felt before, symptoms that made her question everything. When she finally gathered the courage to confront Abdul Rahman, the mask fell. Gone was the kind, caring grandfather she'd once trusted. In his place stood a man who revealed a darkness she never thought possible. She was left trapped, alone, and terrified, with a life growing inside her and no one left to turn to. Her one cry for help met only with cruelty and anger from the very man who had betrayed her. She thought her nightmare couldn't get any worse, but she was wrong. One day, he handed her another drink. This time, she knew he wanted her gone. She took a sip, praying she could survive the horror one last time. Amina, just 19, was a young woman full of hope and dreams. Raised in a loving home, her life had been sheltered, protected by her devoted parents, who had given her everything they could. She was their only child, cherished and nurtured. Amina had always felt safe in their embrace, a place where laughter and warmth filled each corner of their modest home. She was used to hearing her mother's gentle voice, her father's protective hand resting on her shoulder, guiding her through life's challenges. But all of that changed one fateful evening. The news came suddenly, shattering her world like glass. A terrible accident had taken her parents from her, leaving her with nothing but memories. Their warmth, their laughter, their guidance all gone in an instant. She was left alone in a world that now felt cold and unkind, with no one to turn to, no one to comfort her in her grief. In her culture, family is everything. Family takes care of its own, and even in the darkest times, family is where you find safety. So when her grandfather, Abdul Rahman, stepped forward, Amina felt a glimmer of hope. Here was a man who had always been in her life, a steady presence she'd known since childhood. Abdul Rahman was respected in their community, a man of strong faith who attended prayers regularly and held a reputation for his wisdom and integrity. She remembered visiting him during Eid celebrations, where he would share stories of her family's lineage, their traditions, their values. He seemed to everyone like the perfect guardian. Amina clung to this last thread of family, believing he could offer her some stability in a world that now seemed so uncertain. So she moved in with Abdul Rahman, hoping to rebuild her life, to start anew with the only family she had left. She looked at him and saw not just her grandfather, but the protector she needed, the guide who would lead her through this dark chapter. At first, life seemed to settle into a quiet routine. Abdul Rahman would often sit with her in the evenings, sharing tea and stories of her parents' younger days, recalling the times when her father was her age, sharing the values he believed Amina should carry on. He spoke of the importance of family honor, trust, and duty, reminding her of how he had always been there for her, even from afar. His words gave her comfort, a sense of belonging in a family torn apart by tragedy. But in the quiet of her new home, Amina couldn't shake a feeling of unease that began to creep into her mind. She told herself it was just the grief, just the shock of all she had lost. But as the days turned into weeks, small things began to unsettle her. She noticed that Abdul Rahman's behavior, so calm and comforting in the beginning, began to shift. Little things, things that anyone else might dismiss. She noticed the way he'd look at her, a gaze that lingered a bit too long, a gaze that left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she couldn't explain. Then, there were the sudden restrictions. At first, they were minor. He'd tell her it wasn't safe for her to go out alone, that she should stay close to home, where he could protect her. He'd remind her that her family's reputation depended on her, that as a young woman, her actions could bring either honor or shame to their name. She respected his wishes, wanting to honor her parents' memory, wanting to please the man who had stepped up when she had no one left. But these restrictions became more intense. Soon, he told her not to speak to others in the neighborhood. He insisted that visitors weren't welcome, that it was best for her to stay isolated, to focus on grieving and healing in solitude. Amina felt trapped, her world growing smaller each day, confined to the walls of his home. She couldn't understand why her own grandfather, her protector, seemed so determined to keep her isolated, to strip away any connection she had to the world outside. And yet, she stayed. She stayed because he was her grandfather, the last piece of family she had. She reminded herself that he was doing this for her safety, that he was fulfilling his duty to protect her in the only way he knew how. She wanted to trust him, to believe that his intentions were pure, that he genuinely cared for her well-being. But that growing sense of unease, that subtle fear, stayed with her, lingering in the back of her mind, whispering doubts she dared not speak. Amina was torn between the memories of her loving parents and the unsettling presence of the man who now held control over her life. Every night, as she lay awake in the small room he had given her, she found herself wondering about the future, wondering if she could ever escape the shadow that seemed to creep over her more with each passing day. But she didn't know. She couldn't have known that her life was about to spiral into something far darker than she had ever imagined. In her innocence, she clung to the hope that family could still mean protection, that her grandfather would never betray her. Amina couldn't have known that the man she trusted, the man she thought would protect her, was about to drag her into a nightmare she would never be able to forget. As the days passed, Amina tried to adjust to her new life under Abdul Rahman's care. She followed his rules, trusted his guidance, and focused on her healing, telling herself that he was only looking out for her. He was her grandfather, after all, the one person who had stepped forward when no one else could. But as time went on, she began to sense that something had changed. The gentle comfort she once felt in his presence began to feel more like a cage, closing in on her. It started with his lingering looks. At first, she brushed them off as concern, assuming he was just watching over her, ensuring her well-being. But his gaze would often settle on her a little too long, his eyes tracing her face, her movements, with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She noticed how, whenever they sat together for tea or meals, his eyes rarely looked away, and when they did, they always seemed to return, as though drawn by some hidden motive she couldn't yet comprehend. She tried to shake off her discomfort, telling herself it was just her imagination, a result of her grief and loneliness. She was desperate to hold on to the belief that her only family had her best interests at heart. But then the restrictions tightened. Abdul Rahman became more controlling, forbidding her from speaking to neighbors or old friends who reached out to check on her. He insisted that visitors weren't welcome in his home, claiming they would disrupt her healing, and that she needed to stay focused on honoring her parents' memory. When she suggested going outside for fresh air or visiting a nearby market, he would tell her it was too dangerous. "The world is not safe for a young woman alone," he would say, his tone growing colder, more possessive. Amina's life became confined to the walls of his home. Every aspect of her routine was now under his watchful eye, every movement observed and, at times, criticized. If she stayed up too late reading or didn't finish her food, he would scold her, his tone growing harsher each time. He spoke to her not with the warmth of a caring guardian, but with the authority of a man who expected obedience. The loving grandfather she had once known seemed to be fading, replaced by someone else entirely, someone she barely recognized. One evening, Amina worked up the courage to ask him why he was being so strict. She tried to remind him that she was an adult, that she could take care of herself. But he responded with a look that made her blood run cold, a look she'd never seen before. His face tightened, his eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "You should be grateful, Amina," he said. "I took you in when no one else would. I'm the one protecting you, sacrificing my time and my freedom so that you're safe. You owe me respect, you owe me obedience." The words stung, and Amina was left speechless. She felt a wave of shame and guilt wash over her, and for a moment, she believed him. Maybe she was ungrateful. Maybe he was right, that she should be obedient and follow his rules. But as she lay awake that night, staring into the darkness, the memory of his harsh tone echoed in her mind, planting seeds of doubt that wouldn't go away. Days turned into weeks, and the once familiar walls of Abdul Rahman's home began to feel like a prison. She could feel his presence everywhere, his eyes watching her every move, his footsteps in the hallway when she tried to find a moment of solitude. She felt suffocated, isolated from the outside world, stripped of her freedom, and trapped in a place that no longer felt like home. She started to feel as though she was losing herself, her identity, her voice. She was no longer Amina, the girl with dreams and hope. She was merely a shadow, bound to the whims of a man she no longer trusted. Then, one evening, he invited her to sit with him for tea, as they had so often done before. But this time, something felt different. The room was darker than usual, the air thick with an unspoken tension. As she sat across from him, she noticed the way his hands trembled as he poured the tea, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. He handed her a cup, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment, a touch that felt invasive, foreign, wrong. Amina hesitated, but not wanting to arouse his anger, she took the cup, bringing it to her lips. As she drank, she felt a strange taste, a bitterness that lingered on her tongue. She glanced up at him, her eyes questioning, but he simply watched her in silence, his expression unreadable. Within moments, a heavy fog settled over her mind. Her vision blurred, her limbs grew weak, and she felt herself slipping away, lost in a haze of confusion and fear. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, faint memories flashed before her eyes. Memories of her childhood, of her parents, of the life she once had. But these memories were fragmented, mixed with images of her grandfather's shadow looming over her, his face twisted in a way she could barely recognize. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but her body felt numb, unresponsive. And as darkness claimed her, she felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal and dread, realizing that the man she had trusted above all others was the source of her nightmare. When Amina finally awoke, it was hours later, her mind foggy and her body aching. She could barely remember what had happened, could barely piece together the fragments of her memory from the night before. But something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. Her body felt different, her spirit broken. She looked at Abdul Rahman, who greeted her with a calm, almost indifferent expression, as though nothing had happened. "You are unwell," he said. "It must have been the tea. You need rest." Amina wanted to believe him, to trust his words, to tell herself that everything was normal, that she was just imagining things. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something terrible had happened that night, something she couldn't fully comprehend. And as she looked into the eyes of the man she once called her protector, she saw only a stranger who had stolen her innocence, her peace, and her trust. Amina was now trapped, a prisoner in her own life, surrounded by walls that once felt like home but now held nothing but fear and silence. She couldn't escape, couldn't tell anyone, couldn't even fully understand the darkness that had taken root in her life. All she knew was that the man she once trusted was no longer her grandfather, He was something far more sinister, and her nightmare was only beginning. One evening, as the night fell quiet and the house was bathed in the dim glow of evening light, Abdul Rahman called Amina into the kitchen. His tone was softer than usual, almost gentle, as he offered her a warm cup of tea. The smell was familiar, comforting even. A blend of herbs he claimed would calm her, would help her find some peace after the days filled with isolation and unease. She looked into his eyes, searching for the grandfather she once knew, for the man who had taken her in when she had no one left. Amina, still clinging to the belief that there was goodness somewhere in him, accepted the drink, feeling a small sense of relief. She took a sip, feeling the warmth spread through her body, a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, she thought everything might be okay. But as she took another sip, she noticed a strange taste. Bitter and sharp, cutting through the sweetness he'd used to mask it. She hesitated, feeling a prickle of doubt, a faint alarm ringing in her mind. But he watched her closely, his eyes unwavering, and she forced herself to continue, not wanting to anger him. Moments after finishing, she felt her thoughts grow heavy, her vision blurring. The edges of the room seemed to melt, fading into shadows as her body became leaden, sinking her into a haze she couldn't fight. She tried to stand, tried to ask him what was happening, but her voice barely escaped her lips. Abdul Rahman's face loomed above her, distant and strange, his eyes watching her with an intensity that made her heart pound in fear. She struggled to understand, to stay awake, but her limbs betrayed her, her strength fading with each breath. She slipped into unconsciousness, lost in the fog of his deceit. In that darkness, strange and fragmented memories drifted through her mind, visions of Abdul Rahman leaning over her, his face twisted with an emotion she couldn't recognize. She felt herself drifting in and out of awareness, flashes of his shadow moving in and out of focus, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She could feel him near her, hear his whispers, but her body lay motionless, heavy and paralyzed, lost to the drug he'd hidden in her drink. And as the fog closed in, her last thought was a silent plea, a desperate wish to escape, to wake up from the horror unfolding around her. Hours later, Amina awoke, her body aching, her mind a jumble of confusion and dread. The room felt different, colder, empty, as though something terrible had happened within its walls. She felt weak, her head heavy, and as she tried to sit up, a wave of nausea washed over her. She couldn't understand what had happened, couldn't piece together the fragments of her memory from the night before. But deep within, a feeling of violation, of something irrevocably wrong, twisted in her stomach. When she looked up, Abdul Rahman was there, watching her from the doorway, his face calm, too calm. He acted as if nothing unusual had happened, his voice eerily normal as he told her that she had simply been unwell, that perhaps the tea hadn't settled right with her. His tone was dismissive, his words brushing off her confusion as if it were nothing more than a bad dream. Amina searched his face, hoping to find some sign of remorse, of guilt, but there was nothing, only that cold, calculating gaze that sent shivers down her spine. In the days that followed, Amina tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that maybe he was right, maybe it had been nothing. But her body told a different story. She felt a sickness growing within her, a weight that wasn't just emotional, but physical, a gnawing discomfort that settled into her very being. She began to feel weak, tired, her strength draining with each passing day. She couldn't sleep, haunted by flashes of that night, by a lingering fear she couldn't shake. She couldn't eat, her body rejecting even the smallest bite of food, as though it knew something she hadn't yet realized. And then, slowly, the signs became impossible to ignore. Her nausea grew worse, her body changed in ways she couldn't deny, and a dreadful realization dawned upon her. Amina was pregnant. A life had taken root within her, a life born from a betrayal so dark, so vile, that it shattered everything she had once believed about family, about trust, about the man she had called her grandfather. Her mind was a whirlwind of horror and disbelief, her heart shattered by the knowledge of what he had done to her. She felt trapped, a prisoner within her own body, bound by the consequences of his monstrous actions. The walls of Abdul Rahman's home, which had once felt safe, now felt like a tomb, enclosing her in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Every morning, as she faced him across the breakfast table, She felt a nauseating mixture of fear and hatred, a bitter anger burning within her that she couldn't express, couldn't release. She was silenced, trapped, bound to his control by the very life growing inside her. Amina's days became a twisted blend of horror and helplessness, each moment a reminder of the nightmare he had forced upon her. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, anyone, but she knew that no one would believe her, that she was alone in a world that had turned its back on her. Her grandfather's reputation, his standing in the community, would protect him, shielding him from any accusation she dared to make. And she, a young woman with no one to defend her, would be left to bear the shame and the horror of his betrayal. As the days turned into weeks, Amina felt her spirit breaking, her will fading under the weight of his oppression. She was haunted by the knowledge of her pregnancy, a constant reminder of the night he had taken everything from her. She would lie awake at night, staring into the darkness, her mind replaying every moment, every detail, every cruel word he had spoken. She felt her heart harden, her innocence slipping away, replaced by a cold resolve, a resolve to survive, to endure, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how deep his betrayal had cut. In the silence of the night, alone in her room, Amina made a silent promise to herself. She would survive this. She would find a way to escape, to free herself from the nightmare Abdul Rahman had forced upon her. She didn't know how, didn't know when, but she knew that someday, somehow, she would find a way to break free. Until then, she would endure, holding on to the last shreds of her strength, her dignity, her resolve. She was determined to survive, to reclaim her life from the man who had tried to steal it from her. For now, she had no choice but to stay silent, to endure the pain, the shame, the horror of what he had done. But in her heart, she held a glimmer of hope, a faint light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the deepest betrayal, she was still Amina. And one day, she would find a way to rise above his cruelty, to reclaim the life he had tried to destroy. As Amina's body continued to change, the weight of her silent suffering grew heavier with each passing day. The symptoms were impossible to ignore now. The nausea, the fatigue, the unmistakable signs that confirmed her worst fears. Her grandfather's betrayal had left her with a secret she could no longer hide. The shame, the horror, the sense of isolation, all of it twisted around her, suffocating her, leaving her desperate for a way out. She knew she couldn't carry on this way. She had to confront him. She had to demand answers. One evening, gathering all the courage she had left, Amina approached Abdul Rahman, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She felt as if her very life depended on this moment. She couldn't look at him as she once had, as her protector or her family. Instead, she saw him for what he truly was, a man who had stolen her trust, her innocence, her very sense of self. She took a deep breath and, with a voice that trembled but refused to break, confronted him with the truth. "I know what you did to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, laced with a pain she could no longer keep inside. For a moment, there was silence. The room grew heavy with tension, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to unfold. Abdul Rahman looked at her, his eyes narrowing, his face expressionless, as if her words had no impact on him. But then, slowly, a chilling smirk crept across his face, a smirk that made her blood run cold. Gone was the kind, caring grandfather she had once believed him to be. In his place was a man who looked at her not with love or compassion, but with something darker, something far more sinister. "You think anyone would believe you?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think anyone would believe the word of a naive girl over mine? I've protected you, sheltered you, given you everything, and this," he gestured towards her with a look of contempt, "this is how you repay me?" Amina felt the weight of his words crush her, his cruelty cutting through her like a blade. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, the indifference, the callousness, the complete lack of remorse. Desperation clawed at her heart as she looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of the grandfather she'd once known, any sign that he might feel guilt or shame. But there was none. Instead, his face twisted with anger, his voice rising in a tone that made her heart race with fear. "You will do as I say," he hissed, stepping closer to her, his gaze cold and unforgiving. "You will forget this nonsense, or I'll make sure you regret ever speaking of it. Do you understand?" His words were a command, a threat that left no room for argument. Amina felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, a despair so deep that it threatened to drown her. She realized, in that moment, that she was truly alone, that the man she had once trusted would stop at nothing to silence her. She felt trapped, as though she were sinking into a darkness from which there was no escape. But before she could find the words to respond, Abdul Rahman's demeanor shifted again. His voice softening, his face taking on an expression that almost resembled pity. "Here," he said, reaching into the cupboard and pulling out a small vial. He poured the contents into a glass, mixing it with water before handing it to her. "Drink this," he said, his voice soothing, almost gentle. "It will make everything better. It will take care of the problem." Amina looked at the glass in his hand, her heart pounding with a sense of dread. She knew better than to trust him, knew that whatever was in that glass was meant to silence her once and for all. But as he held it out to her, his eyes watching her with a chilling intensity, she felt her options slipping away. She was alone, desperate, and afraid, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he'd gotten what he wanted. With trembling hands, she took the glass, her eyes locked on his, searching for any hint of compassion, any sign that he might still care for her, even if only in the smallest way. But all she saw was a cold indifference, a willingness to do whatever it took to protect himself, no matter the cost to her. She brought the glass to her lips, feeling the bitterness of the liquid as it touched her tongue, a taste that sent shivers down her spine. She tried to resist, tried to stop herself, but he watched her with an unyielding gaze, his presence a silent demand that left her no choice. As the liquid slid down her throat, she felt a strange sensation spreading through her body. A numbness, a heaviness that seemed to drain her of all strength. Her vision began to blur, the room spinning around her as she struggled to stay conscious. She felt her heartbeat slow, her limbs growing weak, her mind slipping into a haze that felt all too familiar. She tried to stand, to call out for help, but her voice was a mere whisper, lost in the silence of the room. She looked up at him one last time, her vision fading, her breath shallow. Abdul Rahman's face was the last thing she saw, his expression cold, unfeeling, as he watched her slip away. In that final moment, a haunting realization washed over her, a realization that this man, this monster, would go to any lengths to protect his secret, even if it meant ending her life. She felt her strength ebb away, her consciousness slipping, her last thought a silent scream, a plea for escape that would never reach the outside world. As darkness claimed her, Amina thought this might be her final moment, that this betrayal would be the end of her story, her life snuffed out by the very man she had once called family. But even as she slipped into unconsciousness, a spark of determination lingered, a glimmer of hope that refused to be extinguished. In her heart, she made one last promise to herself, that if she survived this, she would fight, she would endure, and she would find a way to bring the truth to light. For now, though, all she could do was surrender to the darkness, praying that she would live to see another day. Amina, though weak and barely alive, slowly opened her eyes to the sterile white walls of a hospital room. Her body ached, and every breath felt like a struggle, but she was alive. The fog of confusion and darkness that had clouded her mind was slowly lifting, replaced by a new awareness, a faint hope that somehow she had survived. She couldn't remember how she had arrived here, how she had been found, but the knowledge that she was alive, that she had escaped the walls of her grandfather's house, filled her with a relief so overwhelming she almost wept. As she lay in the hospital bed, her memories began to return in fractured pieces, each one more painful than the last. She remembered the drink, the suffocating darkness, the haunting last glance at Abdul Rahman's face as she had slipped into unconsciousness. The betrayal cut deep, her heart aching not just from what he had done, but from the realization that she had been so completely abandoned by the one person who should have protected her. She was haunted by the memory of his cold eyes, his indifference, his willingness to see her suffer to protect his own secrets. The fear lingered, casting shadows over every thought, every movement, as if he were still there, watching, waiting to strike again. But as the days passed, a new feeling began to take root within her, a desire for justice. The life he had tried to destroy, the secrets he had tried to bury, were no longer his to control. Amina knew that she could no longer remain silent, no longer allow his cruelty to go unpunished. She was determined to reclaim her voice, to find the courage to expose the truth of what he had done, no matter the cost. It was a small, fragile hope, but it was hers, a spark of resilience that had survived even his darkest betrayal. As she lay there, slowly regaining her strength, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. A woman named Fatima, a longtime family friend who had known Amina's parents well. Fatima had heard whispers around the community, quiet rumors of Amina's sudden hospitalization and the strange circumstances surrounding it. Concerned and unable to ignore her suspicions, Fatima had come to see her, hoping to understand what had really happened. She approached Amina with a gentle smile, her eyes filled with kindness, a warmth that Amina hadn't felt in so long. "Amina," Fatima said softly, taking her hand. "I came as soon as I heard. I couldn't believe it when I heard you were in the hospital. What happened, dear? Tell me everything. You know you can trust me." For a moment, Amina hesitated, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. She had been silenced for so long, her voice trapped beneath layers of shame and pain, but as she looked into Fatima's eyes, she saw someone who cared, someone who wanted to listen, someone who wouldn't turn away. She felt the dam inside her break, the words spilling out in a torrent of anguish and desperation. Amina began to speak, her voice trembling as she recounted the events that had led her here. The isolation, the betrayal, the drink that had nearly claimed her life, the horrifying realization of her pregnancy. She held nothing back, revealing every painful detail, every moment of fear and despair she had endured in silence. With each word, she felt a weight lifting, a burden that had been too heavy to bear alone. And as she spoke, Fatima listened intently, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger, her heart breaking for the young woman she had known since childhood. Fatima, horrified by what she was hearing, gripped Amina's hand tighter, her own eyes filling with tears. She couldn't fathom the depth of Abdul Rahman's betrayal, the cruelty he had inflicted upon his own granddaughter. She felt a wave of anger rise within her, a determination to protect Amina, to stand by her as she sought justice for the horrors she had endured. Fatima knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the community might not believe Amina's story, that they might protect Abdul Rahman's reputation over her truth. But she was resolved to stand by Amina, to be the family she had lost, to fight for her when no one else would. In that moment, Amina felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt since her parents' passing, a hope that, with Fatima by her side, she might find the strength to reclaim her life, to break free from the darkness her grandfather had cast over her. She knew the journey ahead would be long, that the scars of his betrayal would remain with her, but for the first time, she felt the weight of his power slipping away, replaced by a strength born from her survival. Amina held on to that strength, the glimmer of hope ignited by Fatima's kindness, her determination to see justice served. She knew that with her friend's support she could face the difficult path ahead, that she could rise above the shadows of her past and reclaim her voice, her dignity, her future. In the sterile quiet of the hospital room, surrounded by the scent of antiseptic and the hum of machines, Amina began to heal. Not just her body, but her spirit, her will to survive. She had been silenced, betrayed, and abandoned, but she was still here. And with Fatima's support, with the strength she had found within herself, Amina knew she would find a way to bring the truth to light, to reclaim the life Abdul Rahman had tried to take from her. It was a small step, but it was hers, a testament to her resilience, a promise that she would not be defined by his cruelty, but by her courage, her determination to survive, and her will to rise above the darkness. As Amina regained her strength, the fire of determination burned brighter within her. She was no longer a prisoner of Abdul Rahman's cruelty, nor would she remain silent in the face of his betrayal. She had survived his attempts to silence her, and now, with Fatima's unwavering support, she was ready to confront the truth head-on, to expose him for who he truly was. Fatima, a fierce advocate now, stood by Amina's side every step of the way. She urged Amina to speak to the authorities, to break the silence that had weighed her down for so long. Together, they went to the police, where Amina, her voice steady but heavy with pain, recounted every detail of the nightmare she had endured. Her words were raw, filled with the agony of betrayal, the fear she had carried alone, and the resolve that now defined her. The police listened intently, their expressions shifting from disbelief to shock, their horror growing with each revelation. They could barely comprehend the cruelty Abdul Rahman had inflicted upon his own granddaughter, the depth of his deception, his willingness to destroy the life of the one person who had trusted him without question. As they documented her testimony, the weight of the case grew clear. This wasn't just a family dispute or a misunderstanding. This was a case of abuse, a violation that demanded justice. The investigation began swiftly, and the community that had once revered Abdul Rahman was shaken to its core. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of the horrifying truths that had come to light. People who had once looked up to him now looked upon him with disgust, with disbelief, as the facade he had carefully crafted crumbled around him. For so long, he had worn the mask of a pious, respected elder, using his reputation as a shield against any suspicion. But now, that mask was shattered, and the man behind it stood exposed for all to see. The authorities soon gathered enough evidence to arrest Abdul Rahman. The day they came to take him into custody, he protested, his voice laced with anger and indignation, clinging to the last remnants of his pride. He tried to deny everything, claiming that Amina's story was nothing more than lies, an attempt to tarnish his reputation. But the evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies, the hospital records, the traces of the drugs he had used to silence her. His denials fell flat, and the strength of Amina's story, her courage to stand up and speak her truth, cut through his lies, leaving him defenseless. As they led him away in handcuffs, Abdul Rahman's gaze fell upon Amina, a glare filled with a hatred that once would have shattered her. But now she looked back at him with steady eyes, no longer afraid, no longer bound by his control. She had reclaimed her voice, her life, her dignity, and she would not let him take that from her again. This time, she was the one who held the power, the strength he had tried so hard to crush. In the weeks that followed, the case went to trial. Amina's testimony was powerful, her words painting a vivid picture of the horror she had endured. She spoke with a strength that left the courtroom in silence, her courage resonating with everyone who heard her story. She recounted the betrayal, the isolation, the night of darkness, the moment she had believed would be her last. Every detail was laid bare, exposing the cruelty of a man who had hidden behind a facade of respectability for far too long. The judge and jury listened, their faces reflecting the horror of Amina's experience. Her story struck a chord, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, the strength it takes to rise above even the darkest betrayals. Fatima sat beside her, a silent pillar of support, her presence a testament to the power of friendship, a family that stands by you when others have failed. Finally, the verdict was reached. Abdul Rahman was found guilty, his actions condemned, his mask of respectability forever shattered. The sentence was severe, a punishment fitting for the betrayal he had inflicted, the life he had tried to destroy. Justice had been served, and for the first time, Amina felt a weight lifting, a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in so long. But even as the sentence was passed, Amina knew that her journey was far from over. The scars of his betrayal would remain, reminders of the darkness she had survived. Yet she also knew that she was more than his victim. She was a survivor, a woman who had reclaimed her life from the depths of despair, who had found the strength to speak her truth, no matter the cost. She had endured, she had fought, and she had won. In the days following the trial, Amina walked through the streets of her community with her head held high. She was no longer the shadow she had once been, bound by fear and silence. She had found her voice, a voice that would never again be silenced. And as she looked towards the future, she knew that she would use that voice to help others, to protect those who could not protect themselves, to bring light to the darkness that had once held her captive. Her story was no longer one of betrayal, but of resilience, of hope, of justice. Amina had faced the darkest parts of humanity, and yet she had risen, unbroken. She had taken back her life, and no one would ever take that from her again. This story, while horrifying, is a reminder of the resilience of those who survive even the darkest betrayals. Amina, scarred yet unbroken, began to rebuild her life piece by piece. A journey that took time, strength, and unyielding determination. She had faced unimaginable cruelty, a betrayal that left deep scars, yet she had emerged from that darkness stronger than before, her spirit refusing to be broken. In the months that followed the trial, Amina returned to her community, her head held high. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been silenced by fear and shame. She was a survivor, a voice for those who couldn't speak, a reminder that even the most devastating experiences could not rob her of her dignity, her resilience, or her right to heal. And as she stepped back into the world, she found herself surrounded by support, by people who offered her kindness, compassion, and understanding. Though many had once been silent, fearful of speaking against someone so respected, they now rallied around her, acknowledging her bravery, her courage in facing what no one else could. Fatima, the friend who had been her anchor, continued to stand by her side, her loyalty unwavering. She had been the light that guided Amina through her darkest days, a testament to the strength of true friendship and the importance of those who refuse to turn away, even when the truth is difficult to face. Together, they began to spread awareness, to speak out for the vulnerable, sharing Amina's story as a warning and as a source of hope for others who might be suffering in silence. Their message was clear. No one should endure such pain alone, and no one should be afraid to seek justice. In her healing, Amina found purpose. She dedicated herself to helping others, reaching out to those who had faced abuse and betrayal, those who needed a voice to speak for them, a hand to guide them. Her journey became one of advocacy, a mission to protect the vulnerable, to break the silence that had once nearly cost her life. She spoke openly, bravely, using her story to shed light on the darkness that exists even in places meant to be safe. Her resilience, her determination, became a beacon of hope for those who feared they would never find a way out. This story is not just about betrayal. It is a reminder of the strength found in survival, the courage that emerges from even the deepest wounds. Amina's journey shows us that healing is possible, that justice can be served, and that no one is truly alone if they are willing to reach out, to hold on to the glimmers of hope that may seem faint, but are always present. Her scars, both visible and invisible, tell a story of endurance, of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. In reflecting on Amina's journey, we are reminded of the responsibility we all carry, to protect, to listen, to remain vigilant for those who may not be able to protect themselves. For those in positions of trust, of authority, who hold influence over the lives of others, it is a call to honor that trust, to remember that our actions, our choices, have the power to harm or to heal. And for each of us, it is a call to never turn away, to offer support and to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Amina's story is not one to be forgotten. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a lesson in the power of courage, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is a path to justice, to healing, and to reclaiming one's life. Take a moment to show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel,